Hi, my name is Sam Shepherd, and I represent ValAsta and some of the research that has been done with regard to ValAsta and Astaxanthin effects on inflammatory diseases. Today, what I want to go over is the effects that we're seeing and the results we're seeing from using ValAsta on diabetes. And first of all, I want to go through how serious of a disease diabetes really presents. In the US, we have about 80 million people who are currently diagnosed as pre-diabetic. What this implies is that if there isn't a change in their lifestyle, they will be type 2 diabetic, requiring medication. In the US today, we have about 8 million people currently taking medication, from metformin all the way up to large amounts of insulin, and to help combat this disease, or at least control the disease. When it comes to type 1 diabetes, which is slightly different, but I'm going to go over that in this presentation, we have about 3 million children and adults with type 1. It's growing at about 80,000 new cases every year. So it's a pretty serious disease. And one of the aspects of this disease is that it appears to be inflammatory driven. And I'm going to go through what we know so far and how best to eradicate it through lifestyle changes and hopefully in a preventative way. First of all, I want to share with you to date 2 important conclusions or results we've gotten from the use of ValAsta containing astaxanthin. 72% of the cases that are diabetic have been taken off of their metformin completely. Their diabetes and their blood sugar levels have been brought into control using nothing more than ValAsta. In addition to that, 81% of the participants who are insulin dependent have seen over a 50% reduction in insulin usage. This is dramatic. It also implies that we are dealing at the root cause of diabetes and not treating the symptoms of the disease. So why is this happening? Those are going to be the topics and the discussion that I'm going to walk through as to what we believe with the current research as to why diabetes is now being addressed through the use of antioxidants and reactive oxygen species control. When we talk about ROS, or reactive oxygen species, as causes of diabetes, the ROS is generated through primarily three steps, metabolic steps. Glucose oxidation. Here we have glucose toxicity, and we have oxidative phosphorylation, which is a metabolic process, usually happens in the mitochondria of every cell. And these metabolic activities create reactive oxygen species that have a tendency to destroy or damage beta cell in the pancreas, and it can eventually lead to the death of those beta cells. Typically, this is the way it happens. You start off with reactive oxygen species. There's a chain reaction. It's a lot more complex than what I'm showing here, but I'm going to leave the complexity out of it. If you want to get into more research as to the steps, that's pretty much available online. But the reactive oxygen species in its form, as to whatever form that it's generated, it can be from stress, it can be from chemicals, it can be from the environment, it can be from heavy metals. Primarily, though, we're going to deal with metabolic generated ROS. Creates an oxidative stress. This membrane around every cell can be attacked by these ROS components, and there's primarily 4, and I'll get into those a little later, but it can cause lipid peroxidation, which is this phospholipid layer around the membrane is made up of a phosphate group attached to a lipid or a fat. These reactive oxygen species can attack that phospholipid membrane and cause complete destruction of that membrane, resulting in oxidative stress to that cell. Typically, inside the cell, we have some antioxidants that are generated by the cell to combat these types of attack. A glutathione, if, for example, a sulfur-based antioxidant is one that comes to mind. This works up to a critical point at which, if the ROS attack is too strong, it depletes the entire antioxidant defense that the cell may have. At that point, you have chronic inflammation now happening, and that will result in oxidative damage, which will go into necrosis or into apoptosis or cell death. The interesting thing is once the antioxidant levels in the cell are depleted, it opens up the attack on the DNA, which can lead to further DNA damage, cancer, and a lot of other inflammatory type diseases. This is a representation of a cell membrane. You can see here the little cell membrane. These are phosphate groups sticking up. This is the outside of the cell. The insulin receptors typically cross, they're transmembrane proteins that cross the cell membrane. This is the outside of this insulin receptor. You can see where the insulin molecule comes in, makes an electrostatic attachment to the insulin receptor. This changes the electric potential of that protein, which really leads into a cascade of pathways that open up glucose channels and allow sugar to leave your bloodstream and enter the cell. This is a more of a internal, external appearance of the cell membrane. Here you see the phosphates attached to fatty acids, which actually makes up the cell membrane. Here you have your insulin receptors reacting with insulin. Here you have the glucose channels that are looking to receive sugar from the bloodstream. Once this receptor is activated, an electric charge, and there's a pathway called GLUT4, there's several of those, that will open up, just strictly from the electric potential, open up these glucose channels and allow sugar then to enter into the cell, and that sugar is in the form of glucose. This is a little better presentation. You have the pancreas over here. Pancreas sees sugar increases in the bloodstream. As a response, the beta cell produces insulin. The insulin and the glucose end up coming down to other cells. Here you have the insulin. It's a key and lock type of an arrangement. The insulin actually sets into the insulin receptor, sets up an electric potential, and there's a pathway, a chemical pathway, that then opens up the glucose channels and allows sugar to open from the outside to the inside, bringing glucose into the cell and depleting the glucose levels in your bloodstream. This brings down your blood glucose levels. This is a representation here showing insulin making a perfect match to the insulin receptor on the cell. When this happens, there's an electric pulse that sets up a series of cascading events that eventually open up a glucose channel, allowing sugar then to enter the cell. So what happens when there's a beta cell that's damaged? For example, in the reactive oxygen species can attack the beta cell in the pancreas right off the bat. In that case, here you have membrane disruption and disintegration, allowing other things to enter the cell. You have mitochondria being affected, generating additional free radicals, which lead to cell death. Reactive oxygen species, if they're not properly managed through the cellular antioxidant attack or defense mode will eventually cause serious cell damage and destruction. Here's a insulin protein that isn't quite formed properly to make the connection to the insulin receptor. This misfolding of insulin is also a result of reactive oxygen species attack. If there's an excess of these reactive oxygen species, they will misfold the protein, the insulin protein. Now the protein cannot make an electrochemical attachment to that insulin receptor, and no signal gets delivered. Therefore, your bloodstream will build sugar in the bloodstream, which raises your blood sugar levels. The cell is now starving. The cell then says, I'm hungry, eat more carbohydrates, eat more sugar, and your blood sugar level only accumulates in your bloodstream. It is not getting into the cell. That creates a tremendous stress problem inside the cell, and that's one of the problems with diabetes, is it eventually lead to cell destruction and kidney failure, and there's several other type diseases that can result, eye failure. Here's a case, for example, where there's not enough insulin. You got the insulin receptors, you got plenty of sugar floating around, but no way to trigger the electrical connection. So in this case here, this is similar to type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas or the beta cells don't exist. This can be genetic. It can be from environmental impacts, where the beta cells in the pancreas have been completely destroyed and the beta cells no longer produce insulin. There's just not enough to get there. In this case here, you're going to be external insulin dependent. Here's the sugars of interest that I'm going to go over. There's several other type of sugars, but glucose, for example, is a 6-member ring, and it's used directly by the cell. It's the only sugar that really is used directly by the cell. Fructose is a 5-member ring. You can see it here. It's a pentose, which means 5-membered ring. And fructose can be converted to glucose in the liver, but also converted to fat in the form of triglycerides. So when you eat a donut that has a lot of sucrose, and I'll show you what sucrose looks like here, your triglyceride levels will go sky high as a result of fructose. But one very important aspect of table sugar, or sucrose, is this linkage. This is called a glycosidic bond. You can see it's joined, the glucose is joined to the fructose with an oxygen link. That oxygen is very, very important because it must be broken to actually recover the glucose for the cells to use. Starches and from flour and breads, starch in potatoes and carrots, root-derived vegetables, all have glucose attachments using the glycosidic oxygen linkage. These can all be formed into long chains. Cellulose, for example, is one of a building block that's made from these. But the glycosidic bond, or the oxygen linkage, is extremely important because it allows the pharmaceutical companies, for example, to attach alcohols to this, or anything with another OH can be directly attached to a glucose molecule. In some cases, we believe that maybe the astaxanthin itself is attached to a glucose, and that's how it's getting into the cell membrane. But more research needs to be done on that. So here's how fructose comes in. When it's converted into glucose, it generates a free radical. Typically, you have peroxisomes that can neutralize some of the hydroxide, which is a ROS, or reactive oxygen species. But in some cases, as we get older, our concentration of peroxisomes go down, our concentration of antioxidants decrease. And that's why a lot of these diseases are age-related. Now we're going to talk a little bit about oxidative stress and the impact that ROS has on that. Oxidative stress refers to any oxidative damage to a cell caused by a reactive oxygen species. Those species, I've got two of them shown here. This is elemental oxygen that exists in the atmosphere. This is a superoxide anion. It has one free electron sticking off to the side, which gives it a -1 charge. This is extremely reactive. And this is usually reacts with an enzyme called superoxide dismutase to try to neutralize this. But when a reactive oxygen species or a free radical reacts, it just generates another free radical. So it just moves down the chemical chain. This is peroxide, highly toxic. Peroxides are generated, for example, when you consume alcohol in the liver. There's a high concentration of peroxides that are formed in the metabolism pathway of alcohol. This is what causes fatty liver. If you don't have enough peroxisomes in your body to neutralize the peroxide, you end up with fatty liver, cirrhosis of the liver, and some chronic problems associated with that. They are extremely dangerous. They result in inflammation and water. Your body will have a tendency to pump fluids into these inflamed areas to try to dilute the reactive oxygen species and carry those to the kidneys for removal. They will cause permanent cell damage and cell death, DNA disruption. So how do we control ROS? Antioxidants. Either we have enough of the antioxidants generated in our own cells, or if we're deficient, we have to add external sources of antioxidants to combat these. This is where the carotenoids, the astaxanthin, comes into play. Now I'm going to go over how astaxanthin plays in this. This is a chemical structure of astaxanthin. You see it has a ketone group, a hydroxy group. The ends of this molecule are extremely reactive. For example, in the glycosidic reaction, this OH would react with an OH on a glucose to form that glycosidic bond, that oxygen linkage. So this could actually attach a glucose right to that point. The other more important aspects of this is, look at these double bonds. This is called a conjugated molecule. It has alternating double bonds. These are loaded with electrons, and that's what gives it its antioxidant capability, in that it can enter into stable resonance in the absorption or the production of free electrons to neutralize free radicals. Now what happens with astaxanthin and ROS, let's take the superoxide anion, which has an extra electron there. In this case here, that electron jumps over here and it's resonance stable onto the astaxanthin molecule. The resulting molecule is just oxygen. For example, these two electrons here, one stays there and the other jumps over here. This is elemental oxygen as it exists in the atmosphere. So it stops the progression and the effects of these reactive oxygen species. Now, how do these affect in the pancreas? This is what ROS does by creating an inflammatory response inside the beta cells inside the pancreas. If the reactive oxygen species of superoxide, hydrogen peroxide, hydroxide, or singlet oxygen reach such a concentration that it begins to destroy these beta cells, the entire production of insulin will stop. The only way to get sugar into the cells now is through an external supplied source of insulin. The other part of this is that the ROS will also go after the proteins. So any insulin protein that's produced, if it comes into a high concentration of reactive oxygen species, it'll cause misfolding of that protein. So that protein cannot make the key and lock connection to the insulin receptor. We see this same effect in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and pretty much all inflammatory related diseases, cardiovascular, arthritis, lupus. They all seem to be functioning, the ROS seems to be functioning in the same way, and that is it's causing proteins to change their physical shape in space. When glucose concentration exceeds cellular oxygen concentration, for example, if you're providing large amounts of glucose and you don't have enough oxygen to maintain the cell in an aerobic state, which means with oxygen, things begin to go badly. Here's a comment from a research paper. Oxidative phosphorylation, which is the mitochondrial metabolism of glucose, during anaerobic, which means without oxygen, glycolysis generates reactive oxygen species. This appears to be excessive in hyperglycemic or in diabetic states. This is something that we now believe that by addressing the reactive oxygen species, we can now talk about a cure for diabetes. So there's quite a bit of work that's still progressing and research that still needs to be done. But we're very, very close in understanding this. When we look at diabetes and oxidative stress, diabetes is directly related to an inflammatory response. It can be reduced through antioxidant addition and dietary changes that can have a major impact on reducing or eliminating diabetes in the future. The problems associated with diabetes is that it seems to be environmentally driven, it can be lifestyle driven, it can be genetically driven. Everyone sets on a normal distribution. For example, genetically, some people may be more predisposed to having fewer antioxidants generated like glutathione than someone else. That person may get diabetes, whereas this person doesn't. So there's a whole range of different levels. The real advantage of looking at it from an attack on ROS is that you can address that entire population by the use of antioxidants that can go in and manage and control the level of those reactive oxygen species concentrations. Here's how we believe that astaxanthin sets and triggers the glucose and acts somewhat like an insulin. The energy level of the astaxanthin molecule is such that it exceeds the electrical requirement to stimulate the insulin receptor. When that happens, that electric charge is initiated even though the individual may not have a pancreas or may not be producing insulin. We still see a reduction in blood sugar levels. So something is activating that insulin receptor. And we have enough now to show that it may be this, the reactive ends of the astaxanthin itself may be imparting that electric charge that opens up the glucose channels and allows sugar to move from the bloodstream directly into the cells. One other aspect of this is that people begin to lose their appetite. They're not as hungry as they were. And the reason is because the cell is now being fed glucose. So the enzymes released that trigger hunger are no longer being released. So the craving for carbohydrates and sugar goes away. And that's one of the other side benefits that we've seen with people using astaxanthin is their blood sugar comes into line, into a normal range, but they also see their appetite suppressed. That is a major finding that didn't exist prior to this. So here we are with the astaxanthin and as to why the ValAsta actually works on diabetes. It reacts with the ROS that's trying to destroy the beta cells inside the pancreas. Sugar, contrary to anything that you may have heard from a doctor, the large consumption of sugar, complex carbohydrates, will give you diabetes. The reason being is that the metabolism of those sugars in the beta cell generate reactive oxygen species, which in turn chronically will destroy the beta cells. So sugar is, in my understanding at this point, is a major contributor to diabetes. The antioxidant improves the body's ability to manage blood glucose levels. And what it does is it saves the beta cells from ROS attack and allows the beta cell then to function normally and to produce insulin. It was found to improve pancreatic beta cell function and keeps the beta cells from dying or becoming destroyed. Now, when a cell is destroyed or damaged, one of the first things that it does is generate reactive oxygen species. So you can see the cascade effect. Once one cell dies, all of a sudden this inflammation occurs from reactive oxygen species. It has to be stopped, or that inflammatory response will then kill 10 more cells. Those 10 will kill 100. And finally, it's auto-accelerated completely into a major inflammatory response. So how to stop diabetes? Reduce your sugar intake to 25 grams or less per day. Not everybody's going to be able to do that, but you have to understand the consequences if you don't. Now, the other side of this is to take an antioxidant, in this case here ValAsta. Make it part of your daily diet. And as you generate those inflammatory responses, take them out. I don't believe that you can, or I can, completely eliminate reactive oxygen species from the metabolic pathways that we have in our cells. But we can manage it. And that's why these types of carotenoids, beta-carotene, astaxanthin, curcumin, it's in turmeric, canthaxanthin, these are all carotenoids that have tremendous antioxidant capabilities. It just turns out that astaxanthin is the most powerful one, natural occurring on the planet. And with that, I'm going to close. Feel free to keep sending your memos, your questions to info@valasta.net, and we'll try to address those questions in a later video. Thank you very much.